Hello, I'm Rich from Medieval History Buff. Thank you for watching my video, and don't forget to like, subscribe and share. Harald Hardrada is one of the most recognisable names in 11th century Europe. He is a giant of a man, both figuratively and literally. He is probably most easily recognised for his invasion of England in 1066, where he was defeated at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. But in this video, I am not going to look at his invasion of England, or even at his time as King of Norway, but instead at the earlier part of his career. Even though I am not going to look at his time as king, I will continue to call him Hardrada, just for simplicity's sake. Harald was the son of a man named Sigurd, who was a minor king in Norway, where he was king of a region just around Oslo, and of a woman called Asta. Asta was also the mother of Olaf II. She had Olaf with her first marriage, and after her first husband was murdered, she went on to marry Sigurd, with whom she had Harald Hardrada. Hardrada seems to have had some sort of loyalty to Olaf, and he fought alongside his brother at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030. Olaf II was a king who sought to Christianise fully the country of Norway, which was still in part pagan. His efforts were not entirely popular though, and he was met with stiff resistance, and there was a rebellion against him which saw him driven out of Norway. He returned, but was defeated and killed at Stiklestad. During this battle, Hardrada is said to have fought bravely. At the time of the battle in 1030, Hardrada would have been aged around 15, as he was probably born around 1015. The sight of his brother's demise despaired the young Hardrada, and he had to be ushered away from the battlefield by some of Olaf's followers after the king had died. For his efforts at Christianizing the pagan country, Olaf was later made a saint, and there are stories of miracles happening after his death, although these are obviously exaggerated. In the aftermath of the battle, Harald and other members of Olaf's army found themselves in Sweden and in exile. In the spring of 1031, Harald and the other men from Olaf's defeated army set sail from Sweden and headed eastwards towards Kievan Rus. Here they arrived at the court of Yaroslav the Wise, who greeted them warmly. Harald seems to have enjoyed himself in Kievan Rus and spent at least a couple of years there, where he travelled far and wide. After he and the other men departed from Kievan Rus, they headed towards Constantinople. I think by this point Harald seems to have been establishing himself as a leader of men. These same men who had fought alongside Harald at Stiklestad had now accompanied him all the way to Constantinople. This shows a level of loyalty towards him. And in Constantinople, and in the Byzantine Empire, Harald would make quite a name for himself. Not long after arriving in Constantinople, Harald soon made acquaintance with the Byzantine Empress Zoe, who ruled jointly alongside her husband, Michael the Fourth. And soon Harald joined the Varangian Guard, the bodyguard of the Byzantine emperors and empresses. As time went by, Harald's stature continued to grow, and there were even mutterings that he should replace the commander of the Byzantine army, a man by the name of Georgios. Harald and Georgios soon began to dislike each other, and tensions continued to grow. But each time the two would quarrel, Harald would always come out on top. Harald then led a Byzantine army into Africa, where he made significant captures against Muslim forces and took town after town and territory after territory. And from there he travelled to places like Sicily, Palestine, Jerusalem, and even possibly Bulgaria. Each time Harald would make significant gains for the Byzantine Empire. But even though he commanded the Byzantine army and his own men incredibly well, there were enemies beginning to cast a doubtful eye against Harald, and when he returned eventually to Constantinople, he found himself a prisoner to the Byzantine Empress. By the time of his return to the Byzantine capital at Constantinople, Harald would have been a fatigued man. His travels, as I have mentioned, had been far and wide, and he had been away from home now for over a decade. And so it's only natural for Harald to have been thinking about returning northwards. But this did not go down well with the Empress Zoe, and she was absolutely infuriated when Harald resigned from the Varangian Guard. There are potential different reasons for why she was so annoyed at Harald's resignation. One is that she might have been annoyed as Harald had been so massively successful in his leadership of his own men and of the Byzantines in capturing territory for the Byzantine Empire. Or another theory goes that there was a rumour that Zoe wanted to marry Harald himself. Her husband died in 1041, and so she now needed someone alongside her. But Harald seems to have had his eyes set on Zoe's niece, a girl called Maria. And so, when she heard this, Zoe is said to have been irate, and Harald was ordered to be sent to prison on trumped-up charges. But he was not in prison for long. In 1042, the Empress Zoe was usurped. The people of Constantinople were furious, and led by the Varangian Guard, they marched upon the usurper. During the uprising, Harald was released from his captivity, and it is said to have been him that blinded and mutilated the usurper, although that is purely conjecture. Despite now being free, Harald still wanted out of Constantinople, and he wanted to head home. But Zoe was reluctant to let him go. So Harald hatched a plan and snatched the girl he had wanted to marry, Maria, Zoe's niece, and he also snatched 2 ships and sailed out of the city. However, he did not intend on taking Maria home with him, and instead he sent her back with a retinue to her aunt at the imperial court. What Harald had wanted to demonstrate here is that Zoe had had no control over him, despite what she may have thought. Harald wanted to show that he could take whatever he wanted, and although he now had put aside the thought of marrying Maria, he was still showing to Zoe that if he had really wanted to marry her, then he could have and would have. This is quite a show of defiance for a man who is still relatively obscure. He is, after all, dealing with the Empress of the Byzantine Empire. However, by this point, I think it's safe to say that Harald was now thinking about Kievan Rus again, which is where he headed, and back to the court of Yaroslav the Wise. And here he married the daughter of Yaroslav the Wise, a girl by the name of Elizabeth. He married her during the winter of 1043, or perhaps early in 1044. And after this, he and his wife headed back to Scandinavia. And so comes to a close an extraordinary start to an extraordinary career. Harald Hardrada had travelled from Norway through Sweden to Kievan Rus, all the way down to the Byzantine Empire. He had travelled to Constantinople, he had travelled to Jerusalem, he had travelled to Palestine, he had travelled to Northern Africa, Sicily, and many, many other places. This is a man who was now becoming ready for kingship. His stature was growing. He had become a leader of men. The loyalty that these men had started to develop for Harald is quite extraordinary. A lot of the men that had fought alongside Harald at Stiklestad had followed him across Europe and into Asia and into Africa. It's a remarkable story, and I've not even scratched upon the surface of Harald's life really. Where I'm leaving the story, around 1044, Harald would not yet have been 30. Still to come was his time as King of Norway and his invasion of England. And it's quite fitting that Harald Hardrada would indeed die in England. That he was not a man who would just die in his bed at home in Norway. He was a man who was going to elevate himself to another level of power, and that he would not just settle for second best. The way he had taken on the Byzantine Empire and refused to be shackled was the sign of a man who was destined for greatness.